Okay, thanks, Devin. There's a lot of information in these sections, so we're trying to go through as quickly as we can. Before I jump into my section, I wanted to just pass on some information that Richard, PDO from Texas, provided me. I think this is an amazing resource. It's a website with one-paragraph summaries of all Supreme Court cases. It's called OES. Oh, yay. Oh, okay. My Canadian accent once again, but OYEZ.org. So OYEZ.org. It's a website with one-paragraph summaries, and it's very helpful in making flashcards of the top planning court cases. So thank you, Richard. Yes, ma'am. No, you're asking, I would say the ethics section is the one. That's kind of my gut. I don't know. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. That would be my gut. We're coming up to that real quick. So this area of practice, this is 30% of the examination, which is 51 of the 170 questions. And this is a really big catch-all category. There's a lot of different things in here. Some of the recommended resources that we like to pull from are Planning Magazine, that blue book, the Planning and Urban Design Standards. And also there's several APA reports and guides to pull from. As you can see here, as we go through these slides of resources, this covers a lot of stuff, from brownfields to art and culture, to benefits of streetscaping for walking and biking, for public health. Another great resources are the PAS reports. The APA made those available to us for free last year. Tremendous resource. And once again, remember the APA is writing these questions, and so this is their own material sources. So I'd likely, if you're looking for some type of explanation of what a brownfield is, in the APA PAS report about it is probably one of the best resources to look at. We talk about here multifamily housing, hazard mitigation, wind energy. It goes on and on and on. I won't list them all. These are the official books. They're pulled from the recommended resource. And then this is the areas of practice. These are actually pulled mostly from the subcategories that the APA actually provides. So we wanted to put these up here because this is a good way for you to familiarize yourself with each of these areas. You could expect to see questions on all of these or some of these, but I think it's very important for you to be familiar with them. One of the new things that they've added in the rewrite is the importance of how planning levels impact our process. And by planning levels, I mean, are you doing a national plan? Is it a policy document? Is it a whole federal study or federal document? Is it multi-state, where you're working with your neighbors, neighboring states, to create a watershed plan, for example, or a transportation plan? And this goes all the way down here to from state to regional, county, all the way down to downtowns and neighborhoods. And the APA wants you to think about who gets involved in these type of planning processes. Is the residents' voice particularly heard loud and clear at the national level? Or does it come up mostly in the neighborhood level, when you really get to talk to people face to face in meetings that are directly impacted from the decisions? And what are the pros and cons of each level of planning? How should you work together? And what type of process should you use? Another thing to keep in mind is comprehensive and sectoral planning. We talk about growth management, long-range planning, comprehensive or general planning, and then regional planning. These relate to that previous slide. They fit into the different levels of planning, and then be familiar with the different types of planning that each of these have. For example, growth management, it ties back to county, and the example that we talk about here is the Chicago MPO CMAP created the 2040 regional plan. It's been updated to have on to 2050. This is a pretty good resource if you want to just see the amount of detail that a typical regional plan gets into. I wouldn't say it's very detailed at all, but it's a very broad brush stroke, talks about all sorts of really good things at a general level, but it doesn't get down to the specifics of we need a specific local road here, or this community needs to do this exact project. It's more of a policy level document. Comprehensive and sectoral planning continued. We talked about fiscal impact analysis, capital improvement planning, and policy planning. I mentioned it earlier before. Capital planning is important to get a lot of your project plan recommendations implemented. And if you get that in your 5-year CIP, for example, the chances of you actually getting that project moving forward are greatly increased. There are likely to be questions about tribal planning. We've just listed here some of the key tribal information to be familiar with. You may be asked questions like this, that it may also be an ethics type question or an implementation type question. Make sure that you know tribes are sovereign nations. They create their own laws, rules, and regulations. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, there are over 500 recognized tribes. The census also says there's 5.2 million people identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, and that there are over 90 million acres of tribal lands. The next area that we wanted to talk about is community, sub-area, corridor, neighborhood planning. Be familiar with the different types of levels in these plans, who you involve along the way, what they focus on. For example, corridor planning. If you think about corridor planning, that may be in an older commercial corridor in your community. It's typically built with vehicles in mind. Back in the day where it was strip centers, no connectivity to the neighborhoods. When you're doing a corridor plan, you might have a lot more different, or you might have different issues related to that than a neighborhood plan, for example. You might have more urban design, street connectivity, or transportation, etc. So just have a general sense of the different types of things that you can incorporate. This here is the planningprep.com world headquarters. Be familiar with how to calculate FAR. This example here is an 8-story structure. So if you wanted to create FAR or calculate the FAR, it would be 4. And then this is a different type of thing. You might even be asked if there's 4 dwelling units on a floor, how many are in the building, and what's that dwelling unit count. Be familiar with the SMART code, the different transects from T2, T3, T4 to the more urbanized up to the T6 and SD. Be familiar with what could happen in each type of these transects, what type of planning you're likely to see, what type of community is in these different areas. Sustainable planning. I think we're all familiar with this. If you look at the program guides for a lot of our conferences, the word sustainable comes up a lot. Just be familiar that sustainable just doesn't mean the environment. It also means social and economic, and that when you tie that together with the environment, that actually creates sustainable development. So be familiar with an illustration like this. You might even see an illustration like this on the exam, and they might ask you to fill in one of those main categories, social, economic, or environmental. Be familiar with LEAD for neighborhood development. And like I talked about earlier, a lot of times architects are involved with you if you want to make sure there's a LEAD development in your community. Transportation planning. There's likely to be several questions about transportation planning. Some of the main terms to be familiar with are mobility. That's the ability and level of ease of moving goods and services. Mobility is different than accessibility. Accessibility means the quality of travel. And at the local levels, access management techniques can be used to provide access to various land uses. The other term we'd be familiar with is connectivity, and that's the quality of linkages between destinations. In each of these screens, we have highlights here of some of the PS reports that talk more specifically about these examples. There's a shared mobility, PS report number 583, which is very good if you need more information on that. Traffic circles and roundabouts. This is just an illustration of a traffic circle that clearly the community doesn't want you to drive straight over anymore. There's a great Mythbusters episode on how roundabouts are a lot safer than traditional signals. One of the main things you may be asked is, what type of intersection reduces vehicle conflicts from 32 down to 8? And the answer would be roundabouts. Does everybody in their community have a roundabout? If you have a roundabout, raise your hand. Wow. And is anybody from Carmel, Indiana here? In the back? Yep. Probably, how many roundabouts do you have in Carmel, Indiana? 300, yep. So if you want to learn about roundabouts, different shapes, sizes, they even have them coming off the interstate. It's amazing. Google it or talk to our friend in the back here. But that's an example. A lot of communities now, engineers are asking if a roundabout, if they ask themselves first, will a roundabout fit? And that's actually their starting point now instead of just a traditional signal. Here's an example right here of Carmel. I don't think are you in one of these cars here? That'd be really cool. No, okay. Here's another traffic circle and roundabout. This is just an elevated pedestrian roundabout. I believe this is in Beijing, but how cool is that? Isn't that awesome? Some more transportation things to be familiar with are transportation demand, the different types of modes of transportation, of course, complete streets. Complete streets, I think we've all accepted. Our engineering friends in our state level departments have, I think, accepted complete streets now. So it seems to almost be commonplace to make sure that we have streets that are not just for cars, but bicycles, pedestrians, etc. Of course, be familiar with pedestrians and bicycles, how they relate to transportation, transit, parking. Be familiar with the level of service categories, and it goes from level of service A all the way down to F. And it's funny, I don't know if I know of any level service A anymore, but this is the different categories you're typically likely to see on the exam. They may ask you which level of service is stable flow, but travelers are becoming restricted in their freedom to select speed, change lanes, or pass, and the level of C is typically the answer. It's interesting because, like I said, I think they should really look at these level of services. It's also important to know that there's level of services for public transit as well. This is an example, I would say, of a level of service F. This was, if you Google this, it's pretty interesting. This was a 5-day traffic jam. I can see just a little bit of haze in the air, just a little bit. But yeah, this was a 5-day traffic jam that was actually started because they were doing construction at the very top of the picture to actually improve the traffic flow through a toll booth system, and you can see that that did not work. But that was a bad traffic level of service F, maybe even something more. Infrastructure planning, be familiar with utilities, community facilities, energy, green and blue infrastructure, communications, and concurrency. Florida has some concurrency legislation that is cutting edge. It's been around for probably since the 80s now, but it's an example of something to be familiar with, even though it's just not just in Florida, but it's an example that started there and has definitely gone throughout the country. Hazard mitigation, we all understand how important hazard mitigation planning is. There's the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which provides the legal basis for FEMA mitigation planning requirements for state, local, and Indian tribal governments as a condition of migration grant assistance. The DMA 2000 also established a new requirement for local mitigation plans. So a lot of communities have their own local mitigation plans. I think planning and the APA really wants to stress that as planners, we're really important in this category to help prepare our communities for if and when a disaster happens. And it also allows communities to, quote unquote, bounce back more quickly. And so be familiar with the different types of components that are typically in a local mitigation plan, and those are listed at the bottom of the screen here. Be familiar with an environmental impact analysis, or an EIS. When do you do an EIS? What type of projects? What is involved in completing an EIS? Be familiar with that one of the answers is always do not do the project. And a lot of these are typically involved in projects that have federal or state dollars involved. Okay, there's typically 4 sections in the EIS, so be familiar with these. The first is that there's an introduction, including the statement of purpose and the need for the action. The second is the description of the impacted or affected environment. Third is a range of alternatives to the proposed action, and that's considered the main part of the heart of the document. And the last one is an analysis of the environmental impacts of each of the possible alternatives. And once again, one of those alternatives is always do not do the project. Shoreline Management Act. It was Washington Shoreline Management Act that was passed by the state legislature, easy for me to say, in 1971, and it was adopted by voters in 72. Its goal is to prevent the inherent harm in an uncoordinated and piecemeal development of the state's shorelines. Economic development. Another thing that's really happened, I think, to planners after the 2008 economic crash was that planners really are looked at a lot for economic development, not just tourism, but also economic analysis and forecasting. Be familiar with the different types of tools and resources that you can use. The importance of having workforce development, business development, being resilient, making sure that your community isn't relying, for example, on one local retailer or one industrial business, for example. Make sure that you have a resilience as well. But speaking of sharing economy, be familiar with what's happening now with Airbnb, Lyft, Uber. How does that impact your environment, your communities? Be familiar how you can either use them to your benefit or how you actually use rules or laws to help govern what can happen with those. Examples of incentives. A lot of us may work for communities that use incentives. There's a variety of tools in our tool belts when it comes to incentives. Be familiar with TIFs, tax increment financing. That's one that you're likely to be asked about. You may also be asked about income tax credits or enterprise or development zones, historic credits, state and local interest or forgivable loans, brownfield sites. There's a lot of different credits out there. You don't have to, once again, be an expert in any of these, but just be familiar enough to know that they're an incentive and when you may want to use them. Urban design. It's very important as planners that we have a focus on placemaking. Once again, to make sure our communities are different and special. Urban design is typically part of a PUD or mixed-use development. They support walkable, wayfinding, infill developments, and mixed uses. There's streetscaping, improving the public realm, and then design guidelines. You may see an illustration like this on the left or this one on the right on your exam. The question may be, what is A, what is C, what is D, or what is B? It may even ask you how to describe that garage. The answer is A would be a decorative cornice, C would be a window hood, D a display window, and B a bulkhead. This garage is actually described as a side-facing, front-loading garage. There's many areas of housing on the examination, from homelessness to affordability, fair housing, new ways to try and deal with affordability. For example, micro-housing. Do any of your communities have micro-housing? Yeah? And is it working well? Is it down? Thumbs down, okay. Maybe, obviously it's different to every community, but interesting. I haven't seen it yet in the community I work in up in Illinois, but universal design is a way, especially for people with either mobility issues or seniors, to live in their current home. Maybe they live in a single family home and walking is difficult. Universal design allows hand railings, ramps, wider doors, etc. Co-housing is a way for people to share maybe common space areas, kitchens, and accessory dwelling units. I know there's a mobile workshop here in the city, I think it was yesterday, of accessory dwelling units, of conversions of garages to residential units. I don't know if anybody went on that, but I heard it was very interesting. Here's some pictures here of some micro-housing. There was a really cool reality show based upon this. I think it was HDTV. It was really cool. I know, and don't tell my wife I said this, but I think we would kill each other if we lived in something like this with my two kids. But, you know, it's interesting. That's just me. Here's an example of co-housing. And here, for example, is a shared community garden area where everybody gets to use the garden. This is in Denver, and it's a very successful development. Parks, recreation, and open space. I think the thing here is to keep in mind that obviously parks, recreation, and open space are important for our communities, that we as planners should promote the inclusion of parks and open space. It doesn't have to be grass areas. It can be plazas, fountains, you name it. It's important for our residents, for livability, tourism, and also health. Very, very important. Historic and cultural resources planning, historic preservation, adaptive reuse, the creation of an arts district, and I think I have a picture here. Here's an example here of the Dallas Arts District, tremendously successful. You know, this picture, it just, you know, it blows you away when you just look at this, about how cool this area is. But they really embrace their arts, and through that, they're really making a destination in this part of the community. There's an APA policy guide on historic and cultural resources here. Basically, just be familiar with the scope of historic preservation, how it's important on the history of our communities, what tools we have to preserve those. In Aurora, Illinois right now, that we're using a lot of historic tax credits to get those developments to happen. But I think we all know, in my experience, it's a lot more expensive to rehabilitate these historic buildings than just create something brand new in a greenfield. So it takes a lot, especially in our community, to get incentives to get that to come up to an even balance where we can actually preserve and fill these businesses. We have some buildings in Aurora, Illinois that have been vacant for 60 years. We actually this year have that building being redeveloped as a mixed use with a restaurant on the ground floor and condos above. And I think our mayor is still doing backflips down the street. It's a pretty big deal. Institutional planning and siting, a lot of us may work for educational agencies, but be familiar with how institutions should be part of our communities, how to plan for them. We may be people that work on military bases as military land use planners. Religious facilities, be familiar with our LUPA, which is legislation that specifically outlines how we have to plan for religious facilities. Make sure you're familiar with that. You don't want to get in trouble, and there's some specific rules in that document. There's been a lot of talk, especially in the APA over the last several years, about food deserts and the importance of community and regional food planning. Be familiar with some of the instances where you could do that. Be familiar with the term food desert, for example. So I'm not going to go through all 8 of these, but be familiar with how they're important in planning our community. Health impact assessments. HIA is a tool that can help communities make choices that improve public health through community design. There's a lot of communities that are creating these health impact assessments. Rural and small town planning. I remember when I audited the exam, there was a couple of questions that were focused specifically on rural and small town planning. Like we said, if we think about the exam as a national exam, that you want to be familiar with everything typically throughout the nation, I think you should also picture yourself as the planner in any town USA. And by that I mean you're at the counter, you're processing plans, you're presenting in front of the council, you're going through the process. If you're just a transportation, and I don't mean just, if you're just focused in a specialized area of planning, like transportation, try to, when you prepare to study, be familiar with all the other areas of planning that are out there. And as I talked about, that's what makes the exam so difficult, because there's so many different areas. One of those areas that they'll talk about is if you're a rural planner in a small town, they'll give you a scenario, what could happen if this example happens, etc. It talks about the loss of farms, declining rural populations. That's a huge impact right now for a lot of the rural communities across the country. How do we deal with that? How do we support the populations? And we want to strengthen their economies and provide better quality of life. There's been even a lot of articles with getting Wi-Fi, for example, and broadband services to rural communities, and that's not helping either. It's really impacting those areas. A lot of great articles out there. Be familiar with those type of issues. Smart growth strategies. I think probably at this point all of us are very much familiar with smart growth strategies. The one thing I wanted to mention is a lot of communities now do walkscore.com. You even see them in real estate ads. This property has a walk score of you name it. Be familiar with those type of things that are out there to help us actually create a way to measure if we're creating smart growth communities. And I'm going to turn it over here to Devin, who's going to talk about leadership, administration, and management. It's only 5%, so he's going to go through this quickly. And then the